What's up, everybody? Marcas Grant Michael F. Florio from NFL Fantasy, and we're here today to talk to you about tight ends. Now, I know what you're going to say. Tight end isn't deep. It's a wasteland. Why are we wasting our time? That's not true. We're going to dig through some tight end issues that might help you when it gets to your 2021 fantasy football draft. So the first question is the one that's going to plague us pretty much all summer long. Travis Kelce. We know he's going to go in the first round. Mike, how early in the first round would you be willing to take a shot at him?
I think the 7th pick is a good spot for Travis Kelce, right after the top 5 running backs and Davante Adams, who is just the best wide receiver in fantasy right now. But after that, Travis Kelce, I think very much so, slides right in there. This year, there was only 3 tight ends that had over 725 receiving yards. Travis Kelce has topped 1,000 in 5 straight seasons. You just get production from him that you don't get out of other tight ends, and he's only getting better. This year, he set a career high in fantasy points, catches, yards, and touchdowns. So, yeah, first round for sure.
Definitely first round. I'm going to name that tune in 5 notes instead. I'm going to say, or you said 7th. I'm going to say 6th, right? So you get the top 5 running backs off the board, and then maybe you take him ahead of one of those top tier wide receivers simply because of the disparity between the top tight ends versus the top receivers. I would love to have Davante Adams on a roster next year, but even if I don't go with a wide receiver in the first round, there's probably a guy I can get in round 2, 3, or 4 that I'd still feel pretty okay with. And the gap between Travis Kelce and the rest of the tight end field was big enough that maybe I reach a little bit earlier for him in my fantasy drafts next year. All right, so let's say you don't get Travis Kelce. Maybe you don't get George Kittle or Darren Waller in the first few rounds. If we're looking at those middle tier tight ends, is there one that you're particularly excited about next year?
Yeah, there is. And he doesn't bring the same upside, I don't think, as those big 3 tight ends, but he gives you what a lot of other tight ends don't, and that's consistency. I like TJ Hockenson of the Detroit Lions. You look at what he did this past season. He finished as the tight end 5, but he had double-digit fantasy points in 10 games this season. That was 3rd amongst all tight ends, and he was just one of 5 tight ends with 100 targets this past season. And he finished in the top 10 in yards and touchdowns as well. So the production is already there for Hockenson, and in his 3rd season, I think it is possible that he takes a step forward. But even if he doesn't, he is very safe and consistent already. So I like him in the middle rounds this year.
I think when we talked about tight ends, we talked about the highs of guys like Kelce and Waller, and we talked about the lows of pretty much everybody else. Having that steady presence like TJ Hockenson, I think, is an underrated value. For me, I'm going to go back to the well from what we talked about last offseason, and I'm going to say Blake Jarwin. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see him this past year because he suffered the injury in week 1, missed the rest of the season. But you look at what the Cowboys offense did with Dalton Schultz. And Dalton Schultz ended up outscoring guys like Evan Ingram, Dallas Goedert, and Austin Hooper. These were players that we took much higher in drafts and thought they were going to blossom into something, and they didn't. So if we saw what the Cowboys were able to do with Dalton Schultz, you get a healthy Blake Jarwin back with a healthy Dak Prescott. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for Jarwin to be one of those guys you sort of get in the middle to late rounds that ends up being very productive for your roster. All right, final tight end topic we got here. Who is your favorite breakout candidate for 2021?
I already know it is Irv Smith Jr. I'm big fan of Irv Smith. I watch him play, and when he gets his opportunities, you're just like, this guy, I understand why they use such a high draft pick to get him. He has all the physical attributes, and he really did come to life in the second half this past season. From week 9 on, he was the tight end 7, and his 5 touchdowns in that span were 3rd amongst all tight ends. But what I'm really hoping for is that they stop allowing him and Kyle Rudolph to kind of take away from one another. In games where Kyle Rudolph sits, Irv Smith has doubled his targets, catches, yards, and touchdowns compared to games where Kyle Rudolph is active. So I think if they just can move on from the veteran presence of Kyle Rudolph and set Irv Smith free, he can be 2021's breakout tight end.
I think we get the hashtag Let Irv Swerve trending in the offseason, so maybe we can sort of make this happen for 2021. My guy's in a similar situation, and that's Cole Kmet for the Chicago Bears. You're talking about You talked about Irv Smith sort of having to battle with Kyle Rudolph for opportunities. Well, similarly, you got a young player in Kmet who's battling with a veteran in Jimmy Graham for opportunities over the last part of the season. If you go back to week 13 through the end of the year, Kmet was third on the Bears when it came to targets and receptions. He ran more routes, had more targets and catches than Jimmy Graham. The problem for Kmet, at least from a fantasy perspective, was that Graham kept scoring touchdowns and sort of taking away from what Kmet's production could be. Will be interesting to see what the Bears do at the tight end position, whether or not they stick with Graham another year. But I think we saw enough from Kmet to believe that he should be a bigger part of the passing game for the Bears going forward into 2021. For more of analysis like this and other things, you can check us out on the NFL Fantasy Football Show. Check it out where you download fine podcasts everywhere. In the meantime, happy off season. We'll talk to you soon.